Buenos días, Adriana Bosch. It is incredible to have you on Conversatorio Cubano. I am a huge fan. I have been a huge fan of your films for more than 20 years, and I think it's a great honor that we have the opportunity to talk about your work and to talk about all that it has inspired others to understand about Cuba, but also how you have come to understand Cuba in new ways, perhaps, through the course of so many years of making films about Cuba, along with films, documentary films about other historical themes in particular. So let me start by saying that one of the things that makes your filmography and your documentaries about Cuba so spectacular is that you take a very original approach, sometimes to subjects that we thought we already knew, and sometimes to subjects that nobody really knows. And the originality of the approach or the originality of the subject then makes for all kinds of dynamic, active viewing on the part of the audience. So I want to talk or have you speak about two films in particular. One is Fidel, which is made or you made in 2005, and the other American Comandante, 2017, both of which formed part of the PBS American Experience series. So I wonder if you could talk about why you made these films and the approaches that you took in each case.
Well, thank you, Lillian, for having me, and thanks for all those nice words that you say about my work. I certainly try to convey and bring to public media, which is where I have developed my career, and a fresh and objective approach to the realities of Cuba as I could see them, and giving voice and participation to different perspectives on the subject. Let me start by saying that Fidel Castro and American Comandante kind of are part of what I consider to be my Cuban trilogy. Mm-hmm. And the three pieces would be Fidel Castro, American Comandante, and of course, Letters to Eloísa, which was the last film to be done. Let me begin with Fidel Castro and how that came about. I spent my career, I started my career as a documentary filmmaker dealing with Latino issues, with issues, particularly Central America, political issues, which were, this is in the mid-1980s, where they were pretty much present in the public arena and political arena in the United States, then in the middle of the Cold War. Then I moved on to making biographies, mostly of great presidents and other American figures. I did something on Eisenhower, Ulysses Grant, Ronald Reagan, Jimmy Carter, and I was actually in London doing a series on the Churchill and on the Churchill family. And my executive producer in London said to me, "Why don't we do something on Fidel Castro?" And I said, "Oh no!" I mean,
first we run away, and then we realize.
No, I mean, basically, I there were two major challenges about that. Challenge number one was I've been, all of the stories that I had done on, that you work on stories in television that have a focus and a short amount of time to tell the story, and then on that story you hang all kinds of things. That's what you choose your stories to tell history. Mm-hmm. So the first challenge with Fidel is like, most presidents have 2 terms, and most, so you can really kind of shape your narrative around those 2 terms, and then go back and forth to their past and their character and all of those good things that a documentary film should have. But here was somebody that by the turn of the century had been in power already for 40 years. And so the first challenge was, how do you do that? How do you take that 40 years and compress it while at the same time maintaining an interesting narrative that gives you enough detail to understand what's going on? The second challenge, of course, is we as PBS, unlike what people say out there, have been very raised, at least in my experience, on objectivity and balance. I mean, and more objectivity than balance, which, as you know, are not the same thing.
Right.
And how does a Cuban American like myself, who knows the story of Cuba, who knows the tragedy of Cuba, and who has lived in her own life and the life of her parents, that tragedy, approach a film about Fidel Castro objectively? How do you balance those points of view about Fidel without having a documentary that has a split personality, which, and people, all you have is an argument between two sides of the question. So that was the second challenge of that film. The film was a great success, I have to say. It sold internationally in about every market. Not that I made any money off it, because it was an American Experience film. I did not own the rights to it. And more to the point, when the film aired in 2006, we received an avalanche of emails at American Experience, and they were totally disgruntled leftists and totally disgruntled rightists. And somewhere in there, we laughed and said, "I guess we got it right."
Yeah.
And so that was really what Fidel was about. It launched me in a direction that I was not expecting to go into, in terms of becoming a filmmaker that dealt with Cuba. I went on after Fidel. What came after that was really kind of a spin-off, and that was American Comandante. I have to say that I had a little more room in American Comandante to be, if not partial, while being objective, to be more critical, because the film itself led you into that direction, and it was very focused in a sense. It's the American Comandante is about William Morgan, whom a lot of Cubans of my generation, and particularly the generation before mine, were very familiar with. He was really a heroic figure, and with women. My aunt loved him because he was blonde, blue-eyed, American, handsome, and fighting for the good cause, which was the Cuban Revolution then. The story is that he quickly falls out, joins the rebellion of the peasant rebellion in the Escambray Mountains. He supplies weapons to them, gets caught, and gets executed. And so that's a story that not a lot of people knew. And I think it's a story that shed light into what happened at the beginning of the revolution, and how, actually it was not, it was a peasant rebellion that really posed the greatest security challenge to the Cuban Revolution in the early, into 65, right? 65.
I would say, though, that when I saw the film, what I really garnered from it was the metaphor, the parable of rebirth and reinvention that is your version of William Morgan's life. That, it's
Right.
not just about him reinventing himself, but also how Cuba and the United States missed this opportunity. They got it hijacked in the case of Cuba by Fidel Castro, but there was this opportunity for a rebirth, a reinvention of the relationship between the United States and Cuba. And,
Right.
and William Morgan is the embodiment of that in so many ways.
Well, academics always go beyond filmmakers in terms of how they interpret films. In fact, yes, it was a film about rebirth and redemption, and the failure of that experiment, as you see it certainly through the life of William Morgan. To me, in terms of the story of the Escambray, it's a story that I always really wanted to tell, because it really, I think, exposed a flaw in a great distance between the rhetoric and the reality of the revolution. If this revolution was being done in the name of peasants, if the agrarian reform was to improve the lives of peasants, then how come, there was a revolt in a coffee growing region of small peasants that ended up being put down brutally, brutally. And, as you well know, some of the tactics that were applied in there were the tactics that we became familiar with in Vietnam, where they basically took out the civilian population that supported the rebellion and moved it out of the region, and the rebellion was snuffed, and that was the story. And so that, along with the story of William Morgan, I thought was I like that film. I think maybe that film was too Cuban for Americans, too American for Cubans, or something like that. There is always that kind of, in my case, I always have to walk that thin line between making something that is palatable and familiar to what was then and now, I suppose, to call the mainstream audience of PBS, and what I feel is my Cuban audience, my commitment to tell stories that Cubans can see and identify with, and have their past, that I can show at Tower Theater and people won't scratch their heads wondering, what is this about?
I mean, I think too, though, you have a commitment to the archive, which is unusual
Yes.
in filmmaking. I mean, a lot of filmmakers do not do their own research, and they don't even write their own scripts. So you have done, having worked with you on a couple of these movies,
Yes.
you have done always. I've not all of your research, 99% of it, it seems. And that is a very liberating process, I think, for the viewer, because you're opening doors onto a past that really haven't been opened a lot of the time, or that alleviate them from the burden of having to carry, especially if your viewer is a Cuban, having to carry throughout the film a kind of pre-existing narrative. You break with what the expectations of the viewer might be, because you bring a completely different paradigm there. And that maybe would lead me to the question about, why did you choose? You have a PhD. I mean, why did you choose to become a filmmaker and make documentary films as an expression of scholarly endeavors? I mean, I think that's one of the things that makes your work so outstanding, is precisely you don't shy away from that.
Well, I come from that tradition. And I think that we recognize, particularly, working with I worked with American Experience for 40 years. And even as I became an independent producer, I continued working with American Experience. I actually wanted to do one last film with American Experience. It's now gone. It's been shuttered. I mean, it's this, which I think is an absolute tragedy for, the pursuit of American history. The one thing that I have to say is that we recognize that our feet are really planted in scholarship and in scholars. We make films based on your work. It is your work that feeds our films. It is your interviews that become the skeleton of our narrative. Maybe not the skeleton of the narrative, but that support our narrative. I sometimes think about myself not as so much as a creator, although I think the story part is where I intervene, but as a synthesizer. The fact that we have to begin, or I begin every film, and I think my fellow filmmakers who have been doing this their entire lives do as well, by reading everything that you could possibly read in the time that you have to research this film. So by the time you even begin to think about what you're going to do, you've already become familiar with the work of scholars. And your challenge is to take all that, try to distill it, and try to place it in the context of a story that has an arc, that has a narrative, and that also has character at the center of it. Because as any storytelling is driven by character, fictional or not. You always need something to drive your story, and really history, at least story, is a character-driven endeavor. I mean, we look at the character and we follow the character, we follow the story, and we hang all of this stuff that is context and that is important onto that spine. Now, the meat of that spine is your work. I mean, you particularly contributed mightily to both Castro and even more so, to American Comandante, and then on to, Letters to Eloísa. You've been part of my process. Maybe you were not in Castro. You were not
No,
yet.
I was still,
You
too
were still a
young.
child.
I had
You
been
haven't, you
teaching.
hadn't been born.
Oh, no, I had just been teaching for 5 years, but
Yeah.
actually want to say this, it was hard back in the day before streaming to get films. And I personally purchased two versions or two copies of the PBS video tape so that I could use it in my classes, both at my first job and my second. So, you've been a part of my teaching and my scholarship because I think as well, that's a film worth watching multiple times. I want to say it's hard to see today. The average person trying to find it on Netflix isn't going to have an easy time.
No, Castro is very hard. What happened with Castro is that it was never reoptioned. I sometimes suspected that maybe PBS thought it was not in keeping with some of the initiatives of the United States politically, that it was not the appropriate approach. The thing you wanted to show the American public, if you wanted to create, because public media is, after all, public media, if you wanted to create support for a political, for a particular approach to Cuba. But that's just me. And, that was probably the only conspiracy ever in my head. But really, the heart of it is what you mentioned, which is the archive. Castro had $300,000 worth of archive.
Wow.
And that's what made Castro special. And it was very special archive too, because what we did is we went to the BFI, the British Film Institute. And at the British Film Institute, they had the collection of archive that had been obtained from the Soviet Union.
Wow.
When they bought the archive from the Soviet Union during perestroika and actually after the fall of the Soviet Union, they went in and they bought this archive and brought it out. After that, the archives shut down.
Yep.
So the BFI, British Film Institute, has this priceless archive, pretty much priceless. Because you can't really, getting it costs an arm and a leg. I think it's $150 per second right now, or 169. Wow. So we went and bought all that archive to do Castro. And I think that's that, and the academics too, but mostly that is the beating heart of that documentary, is that very special archive. And when PBS thought about maybe reoptioning that, after like 8-10 years, you'd have to pay actually maybe that much money to put it back on screen, but there's some DVDs at Amazon, and I always secretly encourage people to, hey man, put it up.
Oh, yeah. I'm not even telling you I'm not telling you how my students watch that. But
anyway, whatever. But there is, you can buy the DVD for $16.99. I just bought one.
Yes.
Yes. Occasionally they come out on the market. It's
so
anyway.
I want to talk to you about your latest film, because in fact now that would be a good time, since you also use a lot of archives. Letters to Eloísa, you will be presenting here at the University of Florida on the 22nd of October, just a couple weeks from now.
Right.
I want to give a preview in part to those who will see the film, but then also those who can find it online and buy it, rent it, stream it. Letters to Eloísa is a beautiful, beautiful film. In addition to being a fascinating film, it's extremely emotional. The music is beautiful. The imagery that accompanies the narrative, much of it shot in Cuba, is just beautiful. So the film focuses on Lezama Lima, who was Cuba's greatest writer during the age of the Latin American boom. he, in many respects, is to this day not as well known as some of his counterparts, certainly
Mhm.
not as well known as Gabriel Garcia Marquez or Isabel Allende, Julio
Vargas Llosa, or any of them.
right, Vargas Llosa, who makes a substantial contribution to the film because he knew Lezama Lima and had traveled to Cuba in the 60s. So Lezama Lima dies in the mid 1970s. And in so many ways, the film attempts and achieves an explanation for how and why the Cuban state ensured that his name and his work would not be known as it should have been in his lifetime and long beyond that. So I wonder if you could speak to the ways in which you think this film contributes to knowledge of the Cuban Revolution, knowledge of Lizama Lima, and then what was lost, what has been lost, because it ends in many respects with that question, you know, who lost here?
Who knows?
Yeah.
Who lost and who knows? Because you never know the future. But let me start by telling you the provenance of that film, which I
Yeah.
think is fascinating. It precedes American Comandante. I mean, that I was, Castro had just aired, and I was going through, must have been 2000 and, I don't know, 2008, 2009. I was still living in Miami. I don't think I'd started, maybe I was working, I don't know, somewhere in there between Latin music and Latino Americans when I became a Latino producer, not exactly by choice, but, that was the role that and I'm very proud of the work I did as a Latino producer, I have to say. And I was rifling through my shelves, and I found these tiny little books, literally about this big and this thick, that Carlos Franchi, who was, I would say the great propagandist of the Cuban Revolution as editor of the newspaper Revolución in the 1960s, later became a dissident and an outspoken dissident. And one of the books was on Jose Marti, and there were many others. And they were supposed to be handed out in Cuba. This is the age before internet or anything, clandestinely distributed among the Cuban population. That's why they were tiny little books. And one of them said letters to Eloísa. And it just caught my eye. I didn't know who Eloísa was. I knew who Lezama Lima was because I picked up Paradiso from somebody's bookshelf, and I looked at it and I said, "Oh, fascinating!" And I learned about, much about Lezama Lima. But I picked up that book, I opened it up, and I started reading the preface, the letters, and I immediately knew at that moment that this is, and I'll be frank, I use this quote without reservation, the film I was born to make.
Huh.
I felt that everything that I knew, everything that I was, everything that I had done, that by then, 40 years of being a filmmaker, led to this moment of making this film about Lezama Lima.
Wow.
So, fortunately, at that time, in Cuba, they were also attempting a rescue of Jose Lezama Lima, literary rescue, trying to dig him up from the obscurity they put him in. And relations between the United States and Cuba had improved. Everything was moving in a positive direction. And I went to Cuba in 2012, and then I went to Cuba in 2013.
Right.
And I obtained from the Cuban government, from the Cuban Ministry of Culture, a letter opening all of the cultural institutions of the revolution, which is how, this is Cuba speak, to me. And so I went twice. I went back into 2013. I did some research interviews in Cuba that I brought. Something told me this was a window that could close. Yeah. So I took a cameraman, from Cuba. I hired this, Chile, they call him, because he was actually Fidel Castro's personal photographer who wanted to make a little buck on the side.
Wow.
And Well, yeah. And so I went with him, and he actually there is some internal censoring to the way those interviews were shot, which we can go into at some other point, not for today. But and I shot a bunch of interviews that I brought home with me. And those interviews were the ones that ended up in the film, because by 2017, what I had actually lined up the funding from the blessed and never to be forgotten National Endowment for the Humanities, which is now being shuttered down effectively. It exists, but it's not, it's nothing like it used to be. Once I finished up all that, I went back and I tried to, I got in touch with Cuba and I said, I'm finally coming. And they said, not so fast. And so I was denied access to Cuba. So here I was left with all this funding and zero access. And so what I did is I had a cousin. So I'm just by way of telling you that this film that you see beautiful and all that is made of shreds from here and there and everywhere. I have a cousin who was then filming in Cuba for something completely different. And I said, Alfredo, I need you to shoot something. And so he went out there, and all of that night film of Havana, the interior shooting in Lezama Lima's home, all of that stuff was done by Alfredo. Basically, trying to, wiggle his way and worm his way into everything that we could get our hands on. And that's a lot of the recreations that were supposed to be done in Lezama's childhood home, and then his home in Trocadero Street, were actually done in the Dominican Republic, and with Dominican actors. Even my Lezama protagonist is a Dominican actor, so everything had to be done differently. And some of the Dominican shoot, if you can, the house in Trocadero Street is so very, very tight, because I have to say that the artwork was not very good, but I had a great cinematographer, so I could skirt that. And that's how that film was put together. Of course, then we had you, and we had Vargas Llosa, and notice I put you ahead of him.
I know. I just want to say thank you for putting me in the same breath as a Nobel Prize winner.
Well, your participation and your contribution to the film were, as they were in Morgan, were very, very important. And I think that you are, without a doubt, an integral part of these two pieces of work that I put up out there, Emilio Vejel. And so I collected some key interviews in the United States that, really fleshed out, and I'm sure that if you see the film, there are more people there, but, and that really, in addition to the interviews that I'd taken out of Cuba, which are which were not really for broadcast, and all of the stuff that I got out of Cuba, including the images of Lezama Lima. And I did have permission to use those. Fortunately, they handed me a DVD with everything they had of this Lezama Lima collected at the house, at the home of Lezama in Trocadero Street. And I was able, within the time frame that I was in Cuba, I don't know how I thought of this. At the time, I got them cleared by the director of the museum. So I had a piece of paper that said that I could use those images of Lezama Lima. Otherwise, that would have never, ever happened. That film would have never, ever happened. But it did. And, okay, ask me again. I'm sorry.
No, there are a couple more things to talk about. I mean,
no, I want to speak about, I know that the process of this film occupies a lot of my attention, because I think, to me, it is almost as important as the making of the film, because it suggests the vagaries. Is that the word? The vagaries.
Absolutely. And historians who work on Cuba.
Of working of policy are the same that Cuban writers and intellectuals have to struggle with on a day-to-day, and I'm sure scholars when can you publish? When can you not publish? Is your work going to be out there? When are they going to remove it from the shelves? So my original intention was to make a film about the letters and about, as I call it, el encierro y la muerte. I mean, to me, it was like the stages of the stages, el Via Crucis, the stages of the cross of Lezama Lima's life.
And the letters that you refer to are the letters that he wrote to his sister.
His sister. His sister gave
the country. And in 1960, she left the country.
She left the country in 1960. And then they began a very wonderful correspondence, which at times was contentious, because he really, when he stayed behind, he was upset that she was leaving. And she was upset, I think, that, and under quite a bit of pressure from the exile community, that Lezama seemed or was in the part of the Cuban intellectual environment and also of the cultural establishment. He was a vice president of the Writers Union in Cuba. And so Lezama was engaged with the revolution at that time, never, he always kept his distance and all that. And so at first there was a degree of acrimony between the two of them, but eventually that ceases, that yields to this wonderful relationship where she becomes his savior. He, as many Cubans in the exile community, she becomes not only the person who sends him, cuchillas de afeitar, blades to shave.
Razor blades, which were
razor blades, and she but also her agent almost outside of Cuba. She is instrumental in the international projection of Paradiso. And, they write about, she's sort of like his hidden agent along with Cortázar in, outside of Cuba. So I wanted really to make a film about those letters, but nobody knew who Lezama was. So, I literally was pushed on that more than I cared to be pushed on a film that I had structured in my head, to do a film that is sort of in between a biography, a literary biography, and the Via Crucis, the stages of the cross of Jose Lezama Lima before he's literally crucified, and that's the film that you have. And that was the second challenge of that film, and to try to do that with the limitations that I had, given the access that I was able to have. But, I think I might, every time I look at it, I want to throw it on the editing, on the edit bed and redo it. But that's true with everything I ever made.
It's beautiful. I think maybe one of the things that we would be remiss if we didn't mention, for those who don't know who Lezama Lima is the fact that not only was he a homosexual, but he had this extraordinary courage to write one chapter in his master novel, Paradiso, which we've mentioned several times, that is really a very open homoerotic account.
Absolutely. Yeah. In the middle of a repressive wave in Cuba, what is remarkable about Lezama, I think, in terms of how he approached the Cuban Revolution, is that he decided that he would stay at the margins of whatever it is the revolution wanted him to say or do. He had been planning this novel for years and years, and everybody thought he's never going to finish it because it's a monumental work. And it is really, it's not exactly a narrative novel. It's sort of like this hybrid. It's, but within it, he had put himself in this as a homosexual. And he never hadn't finished the novel until his mother died, because he really didn't have the guts to do that to his mother. So after the mother dies, he decides he's going to publish this novel. And, and at that time, it coincides with the worst time of repression against homosexuals in Cuba. I mean, that's the time of the UMAP, which are concentration camps where homosexuals were sent, of raids across Havana, of homosexuals, of, total prohibition of any mention of, just like homosexuals needed to be eliminated because they were a danger to la moralidad, the morality of the new man in Cuba, who was, to be big macho with an olive green uniform and a machine gun. Oddly, that also applied to women.
Yes.
I mean, that milicianas, except the milicianas had a gun in one hand and a baby on the other. I mean, you're a master at that imagery, huh?
Neither hand is free in the case of a woman. It's
In the case of a woman,
and the rifle. Yeah.
I mean, but and so he publishes this novel with the help of Julio Cortázar, who is one of the other great figures of the Latin American boom, and who saw in this novel, the contribution of a Cuban writer, but also a different kind of novel that should be included at that time, that was then became known as the Latin American boom. Lesamas, if you look at the documentary, that is the turning point. And then you begin to see how the novel is published, and then it's withdrawn.
Multiple languages. I mean, like published in 6 different languages. So
eventually published in 6 different languages. That's what happens after.
Yeah.
It's pulled from shelves. Then they put it back because there is an outcry, and so they say, apparently, and it might be apocryphal. They say they got to Fidel, and Fidel read it and said, nobody's going to understand it anyway, so put it on the shelves. Help me. Let's keep the revolution's reputation as, for freedom and openness and all that with the international intellectual community a little longer, which is what happened. In 1971, Lezama does the second thing that I think is, one is to remain at the margin of the revolution, publish his novel, and stand by it, even if it is against trend, against policy, and risking putting his life at risk with its publication. That's the first thing he does that is really courageous. The second thing that I think he does that is also courageous is in 1971 with El Caso Padilla. And, that's by that time, the Cuban Revolution has now taken a much harsher approach to culture and to publications and all that. And they go after this wonderful Cuban poet, the wonderful poetry of this Cuban poet. I wouldn't say Padilla was wonderful. That's like an overstatement. Yeah. The wonderful poetry of this Cuban poet, that is highly critical of the revolution. I mean, there is the poetry of Padilla in Fuera del Juego, which is the book that creates the issue, is remarkable and really, really critical.
Yeah.
I mean, and so they give, they have, but it's also beautiful. So, there is a prize given to Padilla for this novel, and then the government tries to rescind the prize. And they ask every one of the members of the jury to write a letter of retracting, on giving this prize to Padilla. And José Lezama Lima refuses to retract.
Yeah.
And that is by now like a death sentence for José Lezama Lima. That combined with the memory of Paradiso, where not only is he a homosexual that the Cuban government has now declared totally illegal in the 70s and worthy of prison and, and being thrown into a concentration camp, he has also shown that he's willing to stand up to the Cuban government.
When virtually nobody was doing that.
When virtually nobody was doing that. Everybody else folded. Lezama did not sign. So that was his death sentence. After that, for the next 5 years, there is an entire machinery that documentary delves into in detail. And I watched it the other night, and it seems like a litany. And, it's on this borderline between being repetitive or being so detailed that you feel like you're in the middle of what's the name of that German film that was so
The lives of
The Life of Others. I mean, at the level of detail where the tricks that the government play, how it is that they maneuver, censoring and silencing a human being. I mean, the mechanics of repression.
And I think that, right now, perhaps even more so than when you made the film and it was originally released, which was just a couple of years ago. Right now, worldwide, we are facing here domestically this tremendous surge in the desire to intimidate and to silence through intimidation voice of critique and dissent and of difference. And so it is a really instructive movie for those who are unfamiliar with how that works, because it is something that it works in very similar ways. All authoritarian cultures.
All authoritarian governments follow the same book, left or right. I knew this when I was making this film. And I tried to bring in Masha Gessen, who is the heir apparent of, Hannah Arendt, particularly in terms of the psychological weight on a human being of these mechanisms. Because, there is this controversy, well, how did that affect Lezama? Well, apparently, psychiatrists and psychologists will tell you today that kind of isolation, that kind of censorship, that kind of loneliness that is imposed on somebody like that could be deadly.
Yes.
Yeah. And Lezama dies under the weight of that. The brilliance of this story to me, and I still get, bumps when I is that it's not what you say, it's not what Behel says, it's not what Ponte says, it's not what Vargas Llosa says. It's written in correspondence. This is in black and white. Paper is sitting there at the Heritage Museum, at the Heritage Collection of the University of Miami. I mean, this is a document that this documentary is putting out there. It's not speculation. It's not
Lezama's words. It's Lezama's words.
It's Lezama's words. It's first-hand account of what happens, of the descent of a human being from being the largest expression of culture in his country, the descent to being a nobody, of disappearing, of not having, of people not even coming to visit him because they could get reported and lose their publishing privilege and their ration cards or their access to a trip abroad. Yeah. And so the mechanics, the mechanisms that are employed are really remarkable. And I did it then, okay, I understood that this is true of all authoritarian governments, but this was done before 1920. This was finished in 1920, came on
2020.
I'm sorry, I'm always in the wrong century. Thank the Lord I didn't say 1820 because that's where I'm living now. In 2020, right before the pandemic hit. So what we're going through right now was not in the horizon. I still, so that urge to make it more universal, although I knew it was not limited to communist regimes, but at that time, you knew that authoritarian regimes were Hitler's Germany, Latin American dictatorships, and communist regimes. You never could have imagined what happened, what we're going through today. But it does. I think there is the film, and I wish I could find a way to do this. The film has acquired, I think, more importance because it does apply.
Right. Just like all wonderful, extraordinary pieces of art, it has multiple lives.
It has multiple. Well, thank you for calling it an extraordinary piece of art. I mean, I think it was, to me, it was an achievement of dedication because, that something artistic could come out of pulling all these threads, and making this without the participation of Cuba, and having to do what I had to do it. That I'm really proud of.
Thank you very much, Adriana.
I have one more thing to say, and something that just one more thing to say. I know that we've gone probably much longer than you would want with this, but
time in the world.
well, but I think people's attention, has a, has a limit. When the Cuban government tries later on at the turn of the century and in 2010, somewhat to rescue Jose Lezama Lima, as a part of the centenary of his birth, and also the Cuban Revolution is trying to project a different image abroad. There are all these pro-homosexual, Mariela Castro, and we love gays, and they're making inroads now with gays across the world, and the Cuban Revolution is having a rebirth internationally. They tried to rescue Jose Lezama Lima. Well, guess what? They couldn't, because when the time was for him to shine, which is when the limelight of that mediatic movement, which is what it was a media, movement out there of the so-called Latin American boom, was hitting on all cylinders. Guess who was not there? Lezama Lima was not there. So he did not have the international projection, even though his books sold. But nobody knew him. Nobody saw him. Nobody knew what he looked like. Nobody heard him speak. He was a non-entity. He did not exist in this Latin American boom. So when they went to rescue him, they didn't have that. They had nothing. What are you going to rescue somebody from the obscurity you put him in?
Right.
And so Lezama has remained today kind of, I think you said, the Cuban writer of the boom, the best Cuban writer of the Latin American boom. Alejo Carpentier was pretty good too. So, but he was without, I think, the most important writer of Cuba's 19th century. I think, maybe Alejo Carpentier would give him a run for his money. And that would be, between the two of them. But, Alejo Carpentier was actually more French than Cuban, but, so that's the pain. That's the sadness of what was lost. What was lost was Jose Lezama Lima. What was lost was the possibility that he would become a symbol and a central legacy for Cuban literature. And as you were the one in the film that said that most clearly, what was lost was more Lezamas. What was lost was a school of literature and a school of thought in Cuba that would continue with this legacy, which there are Lezamianos and there are people who have written, but they're condemned to this association with this man nobody really knows.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
And I think that's very, very sad. And I hope that everyone who is partaking in this and who sees this will go and watch Letters to Eloísa and share it. It doesn't, I do it not so much for me, but really, because I think it's a piece of history that still needs to be rescued, and a piece of culture that still needs to be rescued, not just for Cuba, but for the world. I think people need to see the first-hand account of what happens to someone who is censored, silenced, and dies.
Yeah. Thank you for telling this story and for all of the work that you've done, Adriana, for Cuba and for the documentation of history from so many different perspectives. God bless you. Thank you for all.
Thank you. Thank you, Lillian, for having me. And, again, I mean, I'll not, you're my friend, and you're amazing. But, I think you have always been, you've been part of that journey, of the Cuban journey with me. And I hope that, as you know, we always talk about where to go from here. And, maybe there'll be an opportunity to do something else. But thank you for having me. Right. Thanks very, very much for having me, Lillian.
Thank you.